Okay, disabled. Okay, you have just disabled me from sharing the screen. So
I don't know who has. It's not me. It's Eric who controls this Zoom meeting, and unfortunately, he's not on the call, which makes I can't. I don't control. I don't control it. Eric does because he's the host. So he's the one who needs to give permissions. Unfortunately, we're going to have to work around that.
That's too bad because it's much better to, when we're on Zoom, to look at the person we're talking about.
100%
Okay.
agree. Again,
Okay. Right.
Cindy, if you want to send it to me, I'll put whatever I can in the.
I sent it.
Okay. Great.
If you turn your computer so that we can see the actual face of the computer, try that. Just for a minute. Your laptop?
Yeah.
So if you pick it up and turn it so that we're looking at your screen.
But it's, so I think, Stephen, I think Cindy wanted to share the name of share it on the computer. It doesn't work to turn the computer around. She needs to actually get it into the, share it on the computer.
It doesn't. Okay. I'm going to start. Okay.
Yep.
Yes. And anyway, you can. I sent the PowerPoint, so you can access it there if you want. Okay, I'm a little surprised. I looked and I was really felt insecure about this person, Daniel Prude. I thought we would have spoken about him before, but I didn't find his name on the list, so here it is. This starts in Rochester, New York, and his name is Daniel Prude, who died after being in police custody for a week. So on March 23rd, 2020, Daniel Prude, a 41-year-old African-American man, died after being physically restrained by Rochester, New York police officers. According to an autopsy report, the Monroe County medical examiner ruled Mr. Prude's death a homicide that was caused by, quote, complications of asphyxia in the setting of physical restraint, unquote. The autopsy report also included the contributing factors to his death as excited delirium and acute intoxication by PCP. The Rochester Police Department offered no public comment in Mr. Prude's death and for months treated it as an overdose case. So, for many months, Mr. Prude's death received no public attention. His passing first received state and then nationwide attention in September 2020 when the police body camera, video and written reports were released along with the autopsy report. Following the release of this report, protesters began demonstrating outside the Rochester Police Headquarters. So, who was Daniel Prude and what led to his death? There are some different reports on this. The New York Times reported that Mr. Prude was a father of 5 children and lived in Chicago, where he grew up in a public housing complex. But according to documents filed in the court, Daniel Prude was not married and had no children. His mother, Dorothy Prude, is deceased. His father, Joe Louis Prude, lives in Chicago. Daniel was one of 5 children, 2 of whom there's some interference. Your audios are all off? Okay, I'll just continue. His father, Joe Louis Prude, lives in Chicago. Daniel was one of 5 children, 2 of whom died in tragic incidents which reportedly left Mr. Prude rattled. As an adult, Mr. Prude worked in warehouses and factories on Chicago's southwest side, and friends remembered him working to help find jobs for others in the neighborhood. He lived with his sister and grew close to her teenage sons. In September 2018, one of Mr. Prude's nephews shot and killed himself in their home. Mr. Prude's friends said that after the nephew's death, Prude started using PCP in increasing dosages. His behavior became more and more erratic. Before he traveled to Rochester, his sister had kicked him out of her home after a series of paranoid outbursts. He traveled to Rochester to visit his older brother, Joe. Mr. Prude arrived in Rochester the day before his death, and his brother picked him up from a shelter in nearby Buffalo after Mr. Prude had been kicked off the train from Chicago, Joe Prude told the police. Joe reported that upon arrival, after he picked him up, Daniel started acting erratically, jumping head first down the flight of stairs. His brother dialed emergency services for help, and Daniel received a mental health evaluation at Strong Memorial Hospital and was released the same night. But within several hours, Daniel resumed his erratic behavior and ran out of his brother's house around 3 a.m. Joe Prude called emergency services again for assistance. While on the street, Prude shed his long underwear, tank top, and socks. And so we have a picture of him in the middle of the night out in the street with virtually nothing on. A passerby recorded the video, okay, and this is how we know all of the sequence of events. A passerby recorded a video of Prude after he begged someone to call emergency services. But Prude started running when the person called. At 3:16, multiple officers and 2 emergency medical technicians, arrived at Prude's location in southwest Rochester, where he was walking naked and bleeding. One officer got out of his car and approached Prude, pointing a taser at him while asking him 6 times to get on the ground. Prude complied and was then asked by the officer to put his hands behind his back, to which he also complied. During the arrest, he said, "Yes, sir," several times to the officer. Just a few minutes later, 3:20, Prude became agitated again, spitting at officers and yelling, "Give me that gun," until one officer placed a so-called spit hood, a controversial restraint tool, over Prude's head, and Prude demanded that they remove it. 1 minute later, Prude unsuccessfully attempted to stand up before being repeatedly pushed down by officers, who forcibly held him down for approximately 2 minutes and some seconds. Officer Mark Vaughn used his body weight and both hands to press the side of Prude's head to the pavement. Vaughn's report called this a hypoglossal nerve technique, which, according to USA Today, involves jamming fingers into a nerve below the jaw to cause pain and persuade a subject to comply. Officer Troy Talladay applied his knee to Prude's back. Another officer held Prude's legs. At the start of the hold, Prude said, "You're trying to kill me." The officers noticed liquid coming from Prude's mouth as he stopped speaking and moving. As Vaughn released his hold, he said, "You good now?" Prude did not respond. Vaughn then pushed on his head with one hand for 45 seconds while the attending officers chatted. 3 minutes and 10 seconds after the restraint began, one police officer remarked that he had been vomiting during the restraint and his chest compressions appeared to have stopped. He had in fact stopped breathing. Paramedics resuscitated him at the scene, revived him, and he was taken to hospital. But Mr. Prude died on March 30th, that's 7 days after this, after he was removed from life support, 7 days after he was detained. The Associated Press report that police officers pressed Rochester to keep the video of Prude's death secret, fearing a violent blowback if the video came out during nationwide George Floyd protests. A grand jury declined to bring an indictment against the officers involved. An internal investigation by the police department in late April quickly cleared the officers involved of wrongdoing. Since the release of the footage in September, okay, this is months later, which was obtained through public records request, Mr. Prude's family has accused officers of covering up his death to protect the officers involved. They've accused officials of protecting the police officers involved. So what happened to the officers involved? 7 officers involved in the encounter with Mr. Prude were suspended on September 3rd, the day after the release of the body camera footage, and more than 5 months after Mr. Prude's death. 2 days after that, New York's Attorney General, James, set up a grand jury in the fall to consider evidence in Mr. Prude's death. On February 23rd, Ms. James announced that the grand jury would not be bringing an indictment against the officers. In similar cases around the country, criminal charges against police officers have been rare, as grand juries have often declined to indict police following deadly interactions with Black people. I'm almost done. Okay, so now this, I seem to have lost this part. So fast forward, October 6th, 2022, there has been a court case, and not court session, but there's been a settlement. So according to Reuters, on October 6, 2022, the family of Daniel Prude has now settled their case. And so they took Rochester to court, and they've now settled. The family of Daniel Prude, whose March 2020 death under police restraint sparked protests in New York, upstate New York, has agreed to a $12 million wrongful death settlement with the city of Rochester. And why did it end up this way? The city admitted no wrongdoing as part of the agreement with Prude's estate, which Mayor Evans of Rochester said allowed Rochester, a city of 200,000, to avoid a costly court battle. So this is actually where we are now. I just wanted to report on that, of how the outcome a year and a half, 2 years later can be when the family presses charges, and what the outcome, at least the possible outcome can be. I don't think it's a real closure, but that's what Rochester has done, and that's what the Prude family has settled. So let's get back to Mr. Prude and his death. That's why we're here. And me for 9 minutes and 26 seconds to remember Daniel Prude, who died at the age of 41, away from home in Rochester, New York.